That morning I checked my bank account and stared at a zero balance. My phone rang a second later. My son said his wedding was tomorrow. He withdrew all my money and he sold my house. He told me to find a shelter and wished me good luck. I said absolutely nothing. I just made a single phone call. When the wedding day arrived, I burned his entire world to the ground. My name is Aaron. I am 70 years old, and I am a survivor. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family member who severely underestimated your worth and your intelligence. I sat in the profound quiet of my kitchen on a Tuesday morning. The rich smell of dark roast coffee filled the air as I opened my laptop to pay the monthly utility bills. I logged into my primary checking account, just as I had done on the first day of every month for the last 10 years. The screen loaded slowly. The numbers finally stared back at me. A perfect, unbroken string of zeros. $0 and 0 cents. I did not panic. I did not slam my fists against the wooden table. I simply adjusted my reading glasses and clicked on the transaction history tab. A massive wire transfer had cleared at exactly midnight. Every single dollar of my liquid cash had been drained in a single surgical click. The destination account was a private routing number completely unfamiliar to me. I sat there in the heavy silence of my own kitchen and watched the cursor blink relentlessly against the empty balance. My mind worked through the possibilities with the cold precision of a tuned engine. Hackers usually siphon funds in small, untraceable increments. A bank error would show a pending hold. A direct overnight transfer of this magnitude required physical access authorization codes and the ability to bypass two-step verification security protocols. Only one other person alive possessed that level of access to my personal financial infrastructure. I closed the laptop smoothly. The silence in the house grew absolute and suffocating. I waited. My phone rang perfectly on cue. The bright screen displayed the name of my son, Jordan. I answered the call and placed the phone flat on the kitchen table, switching it to the speakerphone. Jordan spoke immediately. His voice was cold, dripping with an arrogant urgency that I had never heard him use with me before. He did not say good morning. He did not ask how my health was. He simply announced that his wedding with Meredith was tomorrow afternoon. He informed me that he had emptied my entire checking account overnight. Before I could even process the sheer magnitude of the theft, he delivered the final devastating blow. He told me he had legally sold my house. He explained that Meredith demanded a flawless, extravagant celebration and a proper financial start to their new married life. She needed the capital, and he needed to provide it to keep her happy. His tone held absolutely no remorse. He spoke as if liquidating my entire life was his birthright. He suggested I pack a bag immediately. He coldly told me to look up local senior shelters or try to stay with an old friend from the neighborhood. He told me he was far too busy with the rehearsal dinner schedule to deal with my sudden housing crisis. Then he wished me good luck and ended the call. The dial tone echoed sharply in the kitchen. I remained entirely silent. I did not shout his name into the empty room. I did not call him back to beg for my money or my home. I simply sat at the table and let the harsh reality of the betrayal wash over me completely. The son I had raised from a boy had just stolen my life savings and sold the roof over my head to impress a white, status-obsessed fiancée who had always looked at me like dirt on her shoe. Jordan believed my silence was the sound of a defeated old man. He thought I was paralyzed by the shock of losing everything. He thought he had left me with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back. He was entirely wrong. My silence was the sound of a man calculating the exact trajectory of a war. I stood up from the table and walked slowly through the narrow hallway of my modest brick home. I bought this property 40 years ago with cash I earned through grueling labor. I built a regional logistics fleet from a single rusted delivery van. I fought through systemic redlining banks that flatly refused to loan capital to a black man and vicious competitors who tried to run my drivers off the road. I survived all of it, to build an empire that stretched across the state. When my beloved wife Cecilia passed away, I raised Jordan alone within these very brick walls. I intentionally chose to live humbly. I kept the old furniture and drove a battered truck because I wanted to teach my son the true value of hard labor. I wanted him to understand that genuine wealth is quiet and that arrogance is a dangerous liability. Looking at the bare walls and the worn carpet today, I realized my lesson had completely and spectacularly failed. Jordan equated my humility with weakness. He looked at my simple lifestyle and assumed I was an outdated relic he could easily discard for a quick payout. He mistook my quiet nature for powerlessness. He forgot the blood and sweat that paved the road he walked on. I needed to clear my head. I unlatched the heavy deadbolt and stepped onto my front porch to breathe the crisp morning air. The damp smell of dew on the grass usually brought me an immense sense of peace. Today it brought a sharp, unforgiving dose of reality. A heavy white envelope was taped securely to the center of my front door. I pulled it free, tearing the thick tape, and ripped open the seal. It was a formal, legally binding eviction notice. The document was executed by a commercial holding company I did not recognize at all. I had exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises before armed law enforcement would arrive to forcefully remove my belongings and lock the doors permanently. The conflict instantly shifted from a stolen bank account to an imminent, terrifying threat of homelessness. Jordan had not just sold my house to a family or a local buyer. He had sold it to a faceless corporate entity that intended to throw a 70-year-old man onto the street before the weekend was over. I stared at the bold black letters of the eviction order printed on the crisp white paper. They wanted me to panic. They wanted me to pack my bags and disappear quietly into the shadows so Jordan could drink expensive champagne at his wedding without the guilt of his father watching him. I folded the eviction notice with precise movements and placed it neatly into my coat pocket. I was not going to a shelter. I walked back inside my home and picked up my truck keys from the counter. The time for being a gentle, understanding father was officially over. I locked the front door behind me and walked toward my truck with a renewed sense of terrifying purpose. I gripped the steering wheel of my battered Ford and navigated the morning traffic toward the county records building. Panic is a useless emotion designed for people who do not understand how systems work. I understood systems. I built a statewide logistics network by knowing exactly which lever to pull and which door to knock on. I parked in the loading zone, dropping a familiar placard on the dashboard, and walked straight through the heavy glass doors of the municipal building. The line for property records wrapped around the marble lobby filled with anxious contractors and irritated homeowners. I ignored them completely and bypassed the queue, heading directly for the restricted administrative offices in the back. 30 years ago, I secured a specialized delivery contract for the entire municipal government. That contract saved the head clerk, a woman named Beatrice, from a catastrophic logistical failure during an election year. She owed me her career. I knocked once and walked into her office. Beatrice looked up from her terminal, her stern expression softening instantly. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I gave her my home address and told her I needed the complete transfer history executed within the last 48 hours. She bypassed the standard request protocols and pulled the digital file directly onto her primary monitor. She printed the documents and handed them to me across the desk, her eyes reflecting a sudden, profound concern. I read the top page. It was a quitclaim deed. The document legally surrendered my absolute ownership of the property, transferring the title entirely to a newly registered corporate holding company. At the bottom of the page, my signature was rendered with terrifying precision. It was not a sloppy imitation. It was a flawless replication of the exact signature I used on official tax documents. My son had not simply stumbled into this betrayal. He had planned it with surgical intent, practicing my handwriting until he could steal my home without triggering a single fraud alert. I thanked Beatrice, folded the forged deed into my coat pocket, and walked back out into the harsh daylight. I sat in the cab of my truck and spread the remaining documents across the passenger seat. Forging a signature on a quitclaim deed was only the first step of real estate theft. Transferring a property title required a certified public notary to verify the identity of the signatory. Jordan could not simply walk into a bank with a forged document and walk out with the deed. I scanned the secondary attachment stapled beneath the transfer order, looking for the notary stamp. There was no standard notary verification. Instead, Jordan had attached a specialized legal addendum. I recognized the document immediately. 5 years ago, I suffered a minor arterial blockage that required immediate surgical intervention. Before the anesthesia was administered, I signed a comprehensive emergency medical and financial proxy granting Jordan temporary absolute authority to manage my logistics company and personal assets if I became incapacitated. I recovered fully within 2 weeks. The proxy was supposed to be destroyed. Jordan kept a copy. He utilized that dormant 5-year-old medical proxy to bypass the notary requirement entirely. He presented the outdated document to the county clerk as proof that I was physically incapable of attending the signing and that he possessed the ultimate legal authority to execute the property transfer on my behalf. He weaponized a moment of genuine medical vulnerability to orchestrate a frictionless theft. He knew the overwhelmed municipal clerks would barely glance at the date on an emergency proxy if the attached paperwork looked official. My son had weaponized the very legal protection I created to secure his inheritance, using it instead to accelerate my ruin. I started the engine. The architecture of his crime was brilliant, but it left a distinct, undeniable paper trail. I merged onto the highway, the rhythmic hum of the tires matching the cold calculation, turning in my head. I had paid for Jordan's entire Ivy League education in cash. I liquidated my most profitable stock portfolios to ensure he walked across that graduation stage without a single dollar of student debt, tethering him to the ground. I gave him the absolute financial freedom I never had. In return, he brought Meredith into my life. She was a woman who practically vibrated with inherited wealth and unearned superiority. I vividly remember the first time Jordan brought her to my modest brick house for Thanksgiving dinner. Meredith stood on the porch, her eyes scanning the cracked concrete and the worn siding with undisguised revulsion. She flatly refused to step inside, claiming the neighborhood triggered her severe anxiety. Jordan did not defend his childhood home. He did not defend the roof his father provided. Instead, he apologized to her. He internalized her disdain completely, absorbing her toxic belief that my choice to live humbly was actually a symptom of systemic inferiority. He began to view my calloused hands and work boots as a humiliating stain on his new polished corporate identity. He eagerly forgot that the massive wealth fueling his designer suits was generated by the diesel fumes and grinding physical labor he now openly despised. I raised him to be a strong, independent man, and he actively chose to become a subservient parasite, clinging to a woman who viewed him as a useful accessory. The theft of my home was not an act of desperate financial necessity. It was an act of profound, calculated disrespect designed to permanently erase his ties to his origin. I needed to know exactly who currently held the deed to my property. I pulled the truck into the parking lot of a local diner, grabbed my tablet from the glove compartment, and connected to the secure municipal database. I typed in the registration numbers of the commercial holding company listed as the buyer on the forged quitclaim deed. Shell corporations are designed to obscure the identity of the true owner through layers of legal misdirection. But my decades operating commercial transport fleets taught me how to bypass superficial corporate veils. I traced the routing numbers back to a parent organization registered out of state. I pulled the master incorporation documents and scrolled directly to the board of directors. A single name sat at the top of the unredacted digital ledger as the sole proprietor. Gregory, Meredith's wealthy investment banker father. The realization struck like a steel beam. Jordan had not simply sold my house to an anonymous third-party buyer to secure fast cash for his wedding. He had specifically transferred the absolute ownership of my prime real estate directly to his future father-in-law. The in-laws were not oblivious bystanders blissfully enjoying a wedding funded by a stolen bank account. They were entirely complicit in the theft. Gregory had engineered the corporate structure to absorb my assets seamlessly, allowing Jordan to pay for his entrance into their elite family by cannibalizing his own father's estate. They intended to crush me and use my destroyed life as the foundation for their lavish celebration. The boundaries of this conflict instantly expanded. I was no longer just dealing with a disrespectful, thieving son. I was facing an entire family of coordinated predators. The target had just grown exponentially larger, and I required specialized ammunition. I put the truck in gear and drove toward the financial district. I parked my battered truck in a commercial loading zone right outside the towering steel and glass monolith that housed Vanguard and Associates. The financial district hummed with the frantic energy of men in tailored suits chasing imaginary numbers and corporate bonuses. My pace remained measured and deliberate as I approached the entrance. I walked through the revolving doors and bypassed the expansive marble reception desk entirely. A young security guard stepped forward to intercept me, his hand raised defensively against the older black man in a worn work coat who dared to ignore the visitor protocols. I did not break my stride. I looked him dead in the eye and told him to call the managing partner before he made a career-ending mistake. He hesitated, his hand dropping just enough for me to step past him and into the private executive elevator. I rode it to the 42nd floor. The air up here smelled of polished mahogany and expensive leather. I bypassed two administrative assistants who immediately stood up to block my path. I pushed open the heavy double doors to the corner office without knocking. Mitchell sat behind a massive desk analyzing a digital spreadsheet. He looked up sharply, annoyed by the sudden intrusion. That annoyance vanished the exact second he recognized my face. Mitchell stood up immediately swiftly, buttoning his suit jacket. He pressed the intercom button on his console and instructed his assistant to cancel his entire afternoon schedule, lock the outer doors, and hold all calls. He did not ask why I was there. He simply pointed to the leather chair opposite his desk and waited for me to sit. Mitchell possessed a terrifying reputation as the most ruthless corporate litigator in the city. He routinely dismantled rival firms and gutted hedge funds with clinical, unfeeling precision. Most people feared him. I knew him when he was a brilliant, starving law student on the verge of dropping out because his financial aid completely dried up. 3 decades ago, my logistics company secured a highly lucrative municipal contract that changed the trajectory of my business. I took a significant portion of those profits and established a private, anonymous scholarship fund specifically designed to catch young, gifted black men slipping through the cracks of the systemic machine. Mitchell was my very first recipient. He only discovered the identity of his benefactor 10 years later when a careless bank error exposed my name on a routing document. We never spoke of it. We did not exchange holiday cards or engage in superficial pleasantries. He simply tracked me down, handed me a business card with a direct private number, and told me his doors would never be locked to me. That silent pact formed an unbreakable foundation of absolute loyalty. I did not come to his office today for standard legal advice. I came to him to initiate a declaration of war against my own blood. I placed the forged quitclaim deed and the printed bank transaction records directly onto the polished mahogany desk. I instructed Mitchell to read the documents. He picked up his reading glasses and scanned the pages. The temperature in the room plummeted as his professional detachment morphed into lethal focus. I explained the precise timeline. Jordan emptied my checking account at midnight and utilized a dormant emergency medical proxy to bypass the notary verification, legally transferring my property title to Gregory. Mitchell's jaw tightened. He recognized Gregory's name immediately. Gregory operated a predatory hedge fund that Mitchell had tangled with in the past. The corporate holding company listed on the deed was a familiar shell entity Gregory used to shelter toxic assets. Mitchell did not offer empty sympathy or useless outrage. He immediately pulled his keyboard forward, and began drafting a federal injunction to freeze the property transfer and lock down Gregory's holding accounts. Simultaneously, he engaged a proprietary forensic tracing software to follow the exact routing path of the stolen cash. The keystrokes echoed sharply in the silent office. I sat back and watched the digital web unfold on his secondary monitor. The software bypassed the initial shell accounts and penetrated the deeper financial layers Jordan had attempted to bury. Mitchell stopped typing. He leaned closer to the screen, his eyes scanning a newly populated data column. The stolen cash from my checking account was completely gone, instantly liquidated to pay various high-end wedding vendors. But that was not the anomaly causing Mitchell to frown. He isolated a specific routing query and ran it through a global banking registry. The screen flashed a bright warning red. Mitchell exhaled a slow, heavy breath. He looked over the edge of his monitor, his expression darker and colder than before. The stolen cash was merely the down payment for a much larger devastation. Mitchell turned the massive monitor toward me. The screen displayed an executed contract from a shadow bank operating out of the Cayman Islands. Jordan had not just forged a property deed. He utilized my social security number, my pristine credit history, and that same forged medical proxy to authorize a catastrophic corporate loan. He successfully secured $2 million in offshore capital. The loan origination documents detailed the exact distribution of funds. A massive portion secured the most exclusive botanical garden estate in the county for the wedding ceremony tomorrow afternoon. The remainder purchased a historic sprawling villa in Tuscany for their month-long honeymoon. Jordan and Meredith planned to start their new elite life entirely funded by my financial ruin. The offshore loan carried a predatory variable interest rate that compounded daily. Since my signature and social security number anchored the debt, I was legally obligated to repay every single cent. The shadow bank had already placed an automatic lien against the logistics company I spent my entire life building. If I failed to make the first massive repayment by the end of the month, the bank would legally seize my fleet, my warehouses, and my commercial contracts. Jordan and Gregory did not just want my house. They intended to completely obliterate my existence, transferring the ashes of my empire into their own pockets to finance their arrogance. The target had fully materialized. Mitchell's hand hovered over his keyboard, fully prepared to electronically file the federal injunction that would freeze the property transfer and lock down Gregory's holding accounts. I reached across the desk and placed my hand over his, stopping the motion entirely. Filing the injunction now would alert Jordan and Gregory that I was fully aware of their actions. It would give them time to shift assets, hide documents, and prepare a legal defense. I refused to show my hand prematurely. I instructed Mitchell to stand down on the injunction and instead focus his formidable resources on the offshore loan agreement. These predatory shadow banks operated on boilerplate contracts designed to maximize collateral absorption, but those same contracts often contained obscure legal loopholes if you knew where to look. Mitchell understood immediately. He spent the next 3 hours dissecting the fine print of the $2 million loan Jordan had secured using my stolen identity. He found the vulnerability in the indemnification clause. Because Jordan utilized a forged medical proxy to authorize the debt, Mitchell could legally restructure the primary collateral obligations. Mitchell systematically severed my logistical company from the lien, actively rerouting the entire burden of the $2 million debt directly onto Jordan and Meredith's future marital estate, explicitly tying it to Gregory's corporate holding company. Jordan believed he had secured free capital by leveraging my life's work. Instead, Mitchell legally transformed the massive loan into a financial explosive device strapped firmly to Gregory's corporate infrastructure. The debt restructuring was executed in complete silence, buried deep within international routing channels where Gregory's domestic accountants would never think to look until it was too late. Jordan and Meredith were undoubtedly celebrating right now, completely convinced they had successfully drained my resources and left me destitute. They truly believed the depleted checking account represented the entirety of my financial existence. They were profoundly mistaken. The money Jordan stole at midnight was simply my operational liquidity, the account I used to pay for groceries, utilities, and daily expenses. Decades ago, long before Jordan even understood the concept of wealth, I structured my actual net worth with relentless paranoia. The massive profits generated by my logistics fleet were quietly and systematically diverted into a series of ironclad, irrevocable blind trusts. I operated as a multimillionaire hiding in plain sight, choosing a battered truck and a brick house to test the character of those around me. Jordan failed that test spectacularly. He assumed my humble lifestyle was a symptom of simple stagnation. He never comprehended that true wealth does not require validation through luxury cars or Tuscan villas. True wealth is the ability to withstand a catastrophic betrayal and possess the silent, overwhelming capital required to completely dismantle the betrayers. The stolen funds were a negligible drop in the ocean of my actual assets, but the theft itself provided the perfect justification for the absolute financial annihilation I was currently organizing. I sat back in the leather chair and authorized Mitchell to initiate the next sequence. Using the immense hidden liquidity residing in my primary blind trust, I directed Mitchell to contact the Cayman Island Shadow Bank. I instructed him to purchase the $2 million offshore loan outright. The transaction was handled through a labyrinth of corporate proxies, completely shielding my identity from the sellers. The bank, eager to liquidate a high-risk loan, immediately accepted the full cash buyout without hesitation. The transfer cleared within minutes. The dynamic of the conflict shifted fundamentally. I was no longer merely a victim trying to defend my property. I was now officially and legally the primary merciless creditor, holding the absolute authority over the massive debt anchoring Jordan Meredith and Gregory's entire financial future. Mitchell closed the purchase confirmation window and leaned back, a rare, genuine smile appearing on his face. He prepared to outline the final strategy for the wedding day execution, but a sudden sharp notification pinged on his encrypted terminal. The alert bypassed the standard communication channels, flagging a high-priority legal filing in the county court system. Mitchell opened the file, the smile instantly vanishing from his face. He turned the monitor toward me, his expression hardening into cold fury. Jordan had not stopped at stealing the house and securing the fraudulent loan. The screen displayed a formal, expedited medical declaration filed just moments ago by a corrupt local physician known for catering to wealthy families seeking to quickly bypass probate protocols. The document officially diagnosed me with profound, aggressive, senile dementia. It claimed I was a severe danger to myself and others. Attached to the diagnosis was a petition for permanent, involuntary legal guardianship filed by Jordan. The court date was already scheduled for early Monday morning. Jordan intended to use the fraudulent medical declaration to completely strip away my fundamental human rights, locking me in a psychiatric facility before I could even process the theft of my home. He intended to erase my mind on paper and bury me alive to guarantee his financial security. The target was no longer just my bank account. It was my fundamental freedom. The air in the subterranean parking garage beneath the private medical clinic was thick with the smell of exhaust and damp concrete. I stood perfectly still in the deep shadows cast by a massive structural pillar. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered with a dull, rhythmic hum, casting long patches of harsh light and deep darkness across the reserved parking sector. I did not have to wait long. The heavy metal fire door at the far end of the facility groaned open. The sharp, rapid clicking of expensive leather dress shoes echoed loudly against the bare concrete walls. Dr. Aris Thorne walked toward his designated parking space with the arrogant, hurried stride of a man completely convinced of his own untouchable status. He wore a custom-tailored cashmere suit and carried a sleek leather briefcase likely filled with the lucrative proceeds of his various ethical compromises. He pressed a button on his key fob, and a high-end European sports car chirped in response, its headlights suddenly illuminating the surrounding darkness. I stepped out from behind the concrete pillar and walked directly into the bright beam of his headlights. Thorne stopped dead in his tracks. The smug confidence evaporated from his face, instantly replaced by a tight mask of defensive irritation. He did not recognize me immediately, likely assuming I was a lost patient or a wandering vagrant who had somehow slipped past the clinic security desk upstairs. He puffed out his chest and aggressively ordered me to step away from his vehicle, his voice echoing sharply across the empty garage. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his cell phone to summon the building guards. I did not raise my hands in surrender. I did not break my steady, measured stride. I walked directly into his personal space, stopping less than 2 feet away from him. The dim, ambient light finally caught my face. I watched the exact moment his arrogant irritation shattered into pure, unadulterated panic as he recognized the man he had just legally diagnosed with profound senile dementia, standing perfectly lucid and intensely focused right before him. Thorne stumbled backward, his shoulder slamming hard against the pristine paint of his luxury sports car. He stammered frantically, trying to construct a coherent sentence alternating wildly between fake medical concern and outright defensive denial. I did not give him the opportunity to weave a narrative or regain his footing. I reached inside my heavy coat and pulled out a thick manila folder. I pressed the folder firmly against his chest. Instinctively, his hands came up to grasp it. I ordered him to open the file and read the top page aloud. His trembling fingers fumbled with the metal clasp. He flipped open the cover. The document on top was not a plea for mercy or a desperate legal injunction regarding my own health status. It was a highly detailed, meticulously verified ledger of his illegal prescription distributions over the last 48 months. He swallowed hard, his terrified eyes scanning the columns of highly restricted narcotics he had funneled to local criminal syndicates under the guise of a legitimate pain management clinic. I instructed him to turn to the second page. His breathing grew incredibly shallow and rapid. The second document outlined a massive, complex offshore tax evasion scheme, completely exposing the hidden shell accounts in the Bahamas, where he illegally sheltered his illicit profits from the Internal Revenue Service. I did not need to lay a single finger on him. I did not need to raise my voice or issue any kind of physical threat. The paperwork itself was a weapon of absolute guaranteed destruction. I explained to him with cold, surgical clarity that Mitchell had already prepared these exact documents for immediate dispatch to federal authorities and the state medical licensing board. I told Thorne that if I gave the signal, his medical license would be permanently revoked before the sun came up. I detailed exactly how federal prosecutors would seize his clinic, auction his luxury car, and ensure he spent the next 20 years of his life locked inside a federal penitentiary. Thorne stared at me, his face entirely devoid of color. He desperately tried to explain that Jordan had manipulated him, that he was simply doing a favor for a wealthy family friend, and that he could easily withdraw the dementia diagnosis first thing Monday morning. I cut him off immediately. Withdrawing the fraudulent declaration would only alert Jordan that I was fully aware of the trap. I needed Jordan to feel completely secure in his victory until the very last possible second. Thorne looked down at the devastating documents, completely bewildered as to how a retired, supposedly destitute old man had acquired classified federal banking records and encrypted medical logs within a matter of hours. He did not understand the true nature of my business. Operating a massive statewide commercial logistics fleet for decades meant I did not just transport mundane consumer retail goods. I moved secure, sensitive freight for everyone. My trucks hauled classified server racks for private intelligence firms, archived physical evidence for high-level corporate investigators, and handled highly confidential document destruction for elite data brokers. You learn a great deal about the hidden architecture of a city when you control the physical movement of its darkest secrets. Over 40 years, I had cultivated a vast, entirely invisible network of powerful individuals who owed me significant favors. When Mitchell needed leverage on this corrupt physician, my network provided the financial and criminal blueprints without asking a single question. Thorne had assumed my dark skin and quiet demeanor meant I belonged in the background, entirely invisible to men of his stature. He did not realize that true invisibility is the ultimate operational advantage. He had arrogantly stepped onto a battlefield, completely blind to the heavy artillery currently pointed directly at his head. I stepped a fraction closer, forcing him to press his back flat against the cold metal of his car. I issued a single non-negotiable demand. I told him he was going to attend Jordan and Meredith's exclusive wedding rehearsal dinner tonight at the country club. I knew he was already on the VIP guest list, invited as a personal friend of Gregory to drink champagne and celebrate the successful theft of my estate. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out a small, highly sophisticated audio transmission wire provided by Mitchell's private security contacts. I dropped the tiny metallic device directly onto the fraudulent ledgers he was clutching to his chest. I instructed Thorne to wear the wire securely beneath his expensive suit. His task for the evening was incredibly simple but absolutely vital. He was to locate Jordan and Meredith during the crowded cocktail hour. He was to initiate a quiet, private conversation regarding the dementia diagnosis. He had to explicitly prompt them to verbally confirm on the recording that the medical condition was entirely fabricated and that they had paid him to forge the documentation in order to steal my company and lock me away. Thorne shook his head frantically, protesting that Gregory would absolutely destroy his local reputation if he wore a recording device into their elite inner circle. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. I reminded him that Gregory might temporarily ruin his social standing, but I held the absolute instantaneous power to put him in a concrete cell for the rest of his natural life. I told him he had exactly 5 seconds to make his final choice. Thorne looked down at the wire, then back up at my face. He saw no mercy, no hesitation, and absolutely no room for negotiation. He nodded rapidly, a terrified, broken man submitting entirely to my will. I stepped back, adjusting my coat, and walked away into the shadows, leaving the trap perfectly set for the rehearsal dinner. The Oakmont Country Club was a fortress of generational wealth, guarded by wrought iron gates and men with coiled earpieces who checked every passing license plate against a digital ledger. I did not drive my battered truck to the main entrance to beg for an invitation. I parked 3 blocks away behind a commercial strip mall and walked directly to the service entrance. Operating a logistics empire means knowing exactly how the invisible grinding gears of the service industry turn. I knew the catering company hired for tonight's rehearsal dinner because I personally handled the shipping contracts for their imported seafood for the last decade. I slipped through the loading dock precisely when the kitchen staff was frantically offloading massive ice sculptures. A pristine pressed uniform belonging to a senior catering captain was waiting for me in a locker room left there by a trusted associate who owed me a substantial favor. I put on the crisp white shirt, the black vest, and the crimson tie. I adjusted my posture, lowering my shoulders and softening my gaze to project the perfect aura of subservient invisibility. I walked directly into the grand dining hall. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over dozens of tables draped in imported silk. Waiters scrambled in a synchronized frenzy, preparing for the arrival of Gregory's elite social circle. No one questioned my presence or my authority. A senior captain commands the floor through total silence and flawless efficiency. I picked up a heavy silver tray loaded with crystal flutes of vintage champagne and stepped seamlessly into the current of the room. The guests began to filter in their voices, a rising hum of arrogant laughter and clinking glasses. I moved among them with absolute precision. I offered drinks. I cleared empty glasses. I navigated the tight spaces between the velvet chairs without making a single sound. The men and women in the room looked right through me. To them, I was merely an extension of the furniture, a silent vessel designed strictly to facilitate their comfort. I positioned myself flawlessly in the shadows, waiting for the principal actors to take their seats at the head table. I stationed myself less than 5 feet from the sprawling, flower-draped head table. I held a bottle of vintage champagne wrapped in a crisp white cloth, ready to refill glasses at a moment's notice. Meredith sat at the absolute center of the arrangement, radiating a toxic, triumphant energy. She wore an ivory designer cocktail dress that cost more than the average working family earned in an entire month. She leaned across the table, holding court, with a flock of bridesmaids who hung on her every fabricated word. I listened with stone-cold detachment as she actively turned my entire life into a pathetic punchline. She regaled her friends with the story of Jordan breaking the news of their wedding to his father. She dramatically mimicked my supposed reaction, painting me as a clueless, destitute old man who probably did not even understand the concept of a luxury destination wedding. The bridesmaids erupted in perfectly manicured, cruel laughter. Meredith boldly claimed that my house smelled like cheap diesel and regret, boasting that they had done the neighborhood a massive favor by selling off that hideous brick eyesore. She completely erased 40 years of my sweat and blood with a single dismissive wave of her diamond-covered hand. Beside her, Jordan sat in absolute silence. He wore a bespoke tuxedo tailored to his exact measurements. He held a heavy crystal tumbler filled with an impossibly expensive single malt scotch. That scotch, that tuxedo, the very chair he sat on, were all bought with the money he had stolen from my checking account at midnight. He took a slow sip, his eyes fixed firmly on the white tablecloth. He did not defend me. He did not offer a single word of correction to his bride's vicious narrative. He simply absorbed her cruelty, accepting the destruction of his father as the required entry fee into her gilded world. I stood there motionless, feeling absolutely no anger. Anger is an uncontrolled emotion. What I felt was a chilling, absolute clarity. I stepped forward and poured another round of champagne directly into Meredith's glass, without spilling a single drop. Meredith had always treated me like the hired help. From the very first day Jordan brought her into my home, she operated under the rigid, unbreakable assumption that my dark skin, my calloused hands, and my quiet demeanor meant I fundamentally belonged in the background of her life. She never saw the founder of a statewide logistics empire. She only saw an old, tired man who did not understand high society and lacked the pedigree to sit at her table. Whenever she visited, she would unconsciously hand me her coat or ask me to fetch a glass of water, bypassing Jordan entirely. I never corrected her. I fetched the water. I hung up the coat in the closet. I allowed her prejudice to solidify into absolute, unquestioned certainty. Tonight, I weaponized her profound ignorance. Her deeply ingrained bias became my perfect, impenetrable camouflage. She looked directly at me twice while I refilled the water glasses at the head table. Her eyes washed over my uniform, categorized my face as irrelevant, and instantly dismissed my existence. She equated visibility with volume and wealth. Because I possessed neither in her eyes, I possessed no threat. Her blind spot was massive, and I resided entirely within it. She could not comprehend the idea that the man she was currently mocking was standing close enough to read the text messages on her glowing phone screen. She felt entirely safe in her arrogance, completely unaware that the predator she thought she had buried was currently pouring her drinks. I retreated to the shadowed alcove near the swinging kitchen doors, pressing 2 fingers subtly against the tiny, flesh-colored earpiece hidden deep inside my right ear. Dr. Eris Thorne was doing his job flawlessly. The terrified physician had integrated himself into a private circle of men standing by the outdoor patio far away from the music. The hidden transmission wire taped tightly to Thorne's chest broadcasted crisp, clear audio directly into my ear. I recognized the deep, booming, authoritative voice immediately. It was Gregory Meredith's father. Thorne followed my strict instructions. He nervously initiated the conversation, asking Gregory to confirm that the expedited dementia diagnosis would hold up under intense legal scrutiny. Gregory laughed, a harsh, guttural sound that rattled through the earpiece. Gregory assured Thorne that the judge scheduled for Monday morning was firmly on his personal payroll. Then the true architecture of the conspiracy fully revealed itself. Gregory boasted to the surrounding men that the stolen house and the offshore loan were merely the appetizer. Gregory's massive hedge fund was secretly bleeding capital weeks away from a catastrophic public collapse. He needed a massive injection of hard physical assets to balance his toxic ledgers. He proudly confessed his ultimate endgame. The second the court declared me profoundly demented on Monday morning, Gregory intended to step in as the primary financial conservator under the forged proxy. With absolute legal control, he planned to force my logistics company into immediate bankruptcy and liquidate my entire statewide fleet, my warehouses, and my lucrative commercial contracts at rock-bottom prices directly into his own failing hedge fund. He was going to use my life's work to save his own sinking ship, leaving me rotting in a psychiatric ward with absolutely no memory of my own name. The wire transmitted every single damning syllable. The trap was no longer just about survival. It was about total, merciless eradication. I stepped backward into the shadows of the country club patio, melting away from the manicured lawns and the clinking crystal. The tiny earpiece remained completely silent as I stripped off the catering uniform in the damp alley behind the main kitchen, tossing the crisp white shirt into an industrial laundry bin. I returned to my battered truck, started the engine, and merged onto the dark, empty highway, heading straight for the towering glass monoliths of the financial district. Mitchell was waiting for me. His corner office was the only one illuminated on the 42nd floor, a beacon of lethal intent cutting through the night. I walked through the heavy double doors and dropped the audio receiver unit directly onto his polished mahogany desk. I recited every single syllable Gregory had spoken on the patio. The initial theft of my personal checking account and the fraudulent mortgage were amateur hour compared to this newly discovered reality. Gregory intended to use the fake dementia diagnosis to legally seize my entire logistics network. He planned to liquidate the hard assets, the fleet, and the commercial contracts to plug a massive bleeding hole in his own failing hedge fund. Mitchell cracked his knuckles, a dangerous, familiar gleam appearing in his eyes. We needed to recalibrate our entire strike package immediately. Simply freezing the offshore loan was no longer sufficient for the magnitude of this betrayal. We had to completely obliterate Gregory's financial foundation before the wedding ceremony concluded tomorrow afternoon. Mitchell pulled up Gregory's public corporate filings, his fingers flying across the keyboard to isolate the specific vulnerability in the investment portfolio. Gregory was desperately over-leveraged, holding highly toxic commercial real estate bonds that were merely days away from total default. He needed an immediate massive injection of capital, and he truly believed my logistics company was his guaranteed lifeline. We decided to give him exactly what he wanted, but we would hand it to him wrapped in financial poison. The counteroffensive required speed and absolute precision. We had exactly 12 hours before the wedding march began. Mitchell accessed the deepest, most restricted tiers of my corporate intranet. We bypassed the standard operational reports and opened the raw internal financial projection algorithms. These were the highly guarded, highly classified documents my executive board utilized to forecast quarterly growth and direct long-term strategy. I instructed Mitchell to clone the master file and begin altering the foundational data variables. We did not create a clumsy, obvious fabrication that a seasoned auditor would catch. We executed an absolute masterpiece of financial deception. We artificially inflated the projected quarterly value of my regional logistics empire by exactly 300%. We embedded fake but incredibly plausible contracts with massive international shipping conglomerates. We inflated the liquid value of our physical fleet and real estate holdings, hiding the bloated numbers beneath complex, legitimate-looking layers of tax depreciations and projected operational savings. The resulting ledger painted an undeniable picture of a company on the verge of a historic billion-dollar valuation explosion. It was the exact financial miracle a desperate hedge fund manager like Gregory would kill to acquire. Once the poison document was finalized and encrypted, we needed to deliver it directly into Gregory's hands without leaving our digital fingerprints. Mitchell utilized a secure, untraceable proxy server routed through a dozen foreign relays to mask our origin. He targeted the primary senior financial analyst working directly under Gregory at the hedge fund. Mitchell disguised the digital package as a panicked, unauthorized leak from a disgruntled mid-level accountant within my own firm. He attached a brief, fabricated email explicitly stating that I was rapidly losing my mental faculties and leaving millions of dollars of untapped growth completely mismanaged and ripe for a hostile takeover. The bait was heavily scented with blood tailored specifically to bypass corporate caution and trigger Gregory's predatory instincts. We hit send at exactly 2 in the morning. We watched the delivery receipt bounce across the globe before successfully landing in the analyst's inbox. Gregory would see those inflated projections by dawn. He would see a golden goose ready for the slaughter. He would immediately begin diverting the last remaining liquid capital in his failing hedge fund to aggressively acquire the offshore debt Jordan had created, believing it was the master key to unlocking a billion-dollar windfall. He would bankrupt his entire legacy, buying a worthless illusion. Mitchell leaned back in his leather chair and asked me if I felt any hesitation about destroying an entire corporate entity and wiping out a family's generational wealth. I poured a glass of black coffee from the carafe on his desk and slowly shook my head. I survived the ruthless, unregulated corporate wars of the late 90s by understanding one fundamental truth about greedy men. You rarely have to defeat them in open, bloody combat. You simply have to step aside and let them choke on their own unchecked ambition. I built my fleet during an era when massive conglomerates routinely tried to crush independent operators through predatory pricing and hostile, aggressive takeovers. I watched brilliant men lose their minds and their fortunes trying to fight those giants head-on. I learned early on that the absolute most effective way to kill a shark is to feed it a razor-sharp hook disguised as a massive, irresistible meal. Gregory was not a sophisticated mastermind. He was just another desperate shark thrashing in the water, blinded by the scent of a fresh kill. He saw my age and my quiet demeanor as a guarantee of easy victory. His overwhelming arrogance completely neutralized his basic survival instincts. I was simply handing him the rope he desperately wanted to hang himself with. The tense silence of the executive office was abruptly shattered by the sharp buzzing of my cell phone resting on the mahogany desk. I glanced at the glowing screen. It was a direct call from Jordan. I did not answer. I let it ring continuously until the automated voicemail system finally engaged. A minute later, an audio file appeared on my screen. I pressed play, putting the audio on speaker for Mitchell to hear clearly. Jordan's voice filled the room, dripping with a sickly sweet, entirely manufactured affection. He called me Dad, his tone laced with a fake, trembling sincerity that made my stomach turn. He claimed he had spent the entire night agonizing over our harsh argument. He begged me to come to the sprawling botanical garden estate early in the morning, hours before the grand ceremony officially began. He explicitly requested I join him for a private family photo session in the penthouse bridal suite, framing it as a necessary emotional step for our reconciliation. The performance was nauseatingly transparent. I looked across the desk at Mitchell. We both knew exactly what this sweet invitation truly represented. There would be no heartfelt reconciliation. There would be no family photographs taken. It was a meticulously orchestrated ambush. If I walked into that bridal suite, the psychiatric transport team would be waiting quietly behind the heavy oak doors, armed with the forged medical proxy and a canvas straitjacket. Jordan intended to have me forcibly sedated and quietly removed through the service elevator long before the first wedding guest arrived to drink champagne. He absolutely needed my physical removal to finalize the complete, uncontested transfer of my assets to Gregory. Mitchell reached for his keyboard, preparing to draft an emergency legal countermeasure to physically block the medical team from entering the venue. I placed my hand firmly over his wrist. I told him to stop. I picked up my phone and typed a brief, direct text message to my son. I told Jordan I would be honored to attend the private session. I accepted the invitation to my own execution. Dawn broke over the neighborhood, casting long, pale shadows across the cracked concrete of my driveway. I stood alone in the center of the living room, surrounded by the worn furniture and faded rugs my son believed defined the entirety of my existence. The house was quiet, stripped of its legal title, but still holding the physical weight of 40 years of history. I walked down the narrow hallway to the master bedroom and bypassed the standard closet. Instead, I pressed my hand against the back panel of the built-in shelving unit. The hidden latch clicked, revealing a sealed cedar wardrobe I had constructed decades ago. The rich, earthy scent of the wood filled the small space. Inside hung a single garment protected by a heavy canvas bag. I unzipped it with steady hands, pulling out a bespoke charcoal suit. I had not worn this suit in 15 years. The wool was flawless, cut with razor-sharp precision, completely untouched by time. I laid it out on the bed and began the process of dressing. Every movement was methodical and deliberate. I fastened the pearl buttons of the crisp white shirt. I adjusted the deep crimson tie, pulling the knot tight against my collar. I slipped into the trousers and buttoned the vest, feeling the weight of the fabric settle over my shoulders like a second skin. Finally, I put on the jacket. I walked over to the mirror and looked at my reflection. The man staring back was not the tired, discarded father Jordan thought he had outsmarted. The man in the glass was a predator who had spent a lifetime camouflaging his true nature to protect a son who ultimately viewed that protection as weakness. I checked my gold cufflinks and adjusted the cuffs. The transformation was absolute. I was no longer the humble man who drove a battered truck and accepted the quiet indignities of high society. I was fully equipped for the absolute destruction of every illusion Jordan and Meredith had built. This charcoal suit carried a specific, undeniable history. I had it commissioned by a master tailor in New York for the exact day I took my regional logistics company public. That morning 15 years ago, I stood in a boardroom, surrounded by ruthless investment bankers who looked at my dark skin and calloused hands and assumed they could severely underprice my life's work. I wore this suit when I walked to the negotiation table, rejected their predatory offers, and forced them to accept a valuation that made me an immensely wealthy man before the markets even closed. It was my battle armor. It represented the unyielding power and the massive ironclad wealth I had deliberately hidden from Jordan. I wanted him to build his own legacy without the corrupting crutch of a massive trust fund. I wanted him to understand the value of a dollar earned through physical exhaustion. Instead, he equated my intentional simplicity with failure. He allowed Meredith and her elite circle to convince him that my lack of designer labels was a shameful disease he needed to cure by stealing my assets. He failed to comprehend that the man who built an empire from a single rusted delivery van did not suddenly forget how to conquer enemies. The suit fit me perfectly, a physical manifestation of the exact authority I was about to unleash upon the people who thought they had buried me alive. I picked up my heavy leather briefcase from the bed, feeling the dense weight of the legal documents inside. I walked out of the bedroom, moving through the silent house for what might be the final time. I stepped out onto the front porch, pulling the door shut behind me, and turned the key in the deadbolt. The morning air was sharp, carrying the distant sound of morning traffic. I walked down the cracked driveway toward my old truck, my polished leather shoes clicking against the concrete. As I reached for the door handle, my cell phone vibrated in my inner pocket. I pulled it out and answered. It was Mitchell. He did not offer a greeting. He simply delivered the final confirmation I had been waiting for all night. The international wire transfers had officially cleared the proxy accounts. My hidden blind trust was now the sole legal owner of the predatory offshore loan Jordan had secured to fund his lavish wedding. Jordan and Meredith were legally $2 million in debt, directly to me, their financial future completely bound to my absolute discretion. Mitchell then delivered the final devastating piece of the strategy. The poisoned financial projections we had leaked to Gregory's analyst had worked flawlessly. Gregory had swallowed the bait whole. In a desperate bid to save his collapsing hedge fund, Gregory had just diverted his entire remaining corporate liquidity to illegally buy out the fake debt of my logistics empire. He transferred millions of dollars to secure ownership of an inflated asset that did not exist. Gregory was now mathematically and legally bankrupt, his entire generational wealth wiped out by a single catastrophic purchase based on fabricated data. The trap we designed in the dark of night was completely armed and fully operational. I thanked Mitchell for his flawless execution and ended the call. The board was set. The pieces were locked in place. All that remained was the execution. I opened the heavy door of my battered truck and slid into the driver's seat. I carefully placed the leather briefcase on the worn passenger seat, securing it with the seatbelt. I put the key in the ignition, and the old engine roared to life, a rough mechanical growl that felt entirely appropriate for the morning. I put the truck in gear and pulled out of the neighborhood, driving smoothly toward the sprawling botanical garden estate located on the wealthy northern edge of the county. The rising sun cast a bright, blinding light across the horizon, but my vision remained completely clear. I was driving directly into the lion's den. The sprawling estate would be teeming with elite security wealthy guests, and the psychiatric transport team Jordan had arranged to ambush me. They were waiting for a confused, defeated old man to stumble into their trap so they could drag him away in a canvas straitjacket and finalize their theft in absolute silence. They expected me to arrive begging for scraps, completely oblivious to the financial slaughter they had orchestrated. I was driving into a heavily fortified compound, completely unarmed. I did not carry a weapon. I did not have a private security detail following my truck. I was entering the heart of Gregory's corrupt kingdom, carrying nothing but the heavy leather briefcase resting beside me. But that briefcase held the absolute truth, backed by millions of dollars of leveraged debt and federal fraud indictments. I accelerated onto the highway, watching the speedometer climb. I felt no fear. I felt no hesitation. I was bringing the silent adjustment directly to their front door, and I intended to burn their entire fabricated world to the ground before they even had the chance to pour the first glass of wedding champagne. The massive wrought iron gates of the Botanical Garden estate towered over the immaculate entrance, flanked by thick stone pillars and a highly fortified security checkpoint. I steered my battered, rusted truck off the smooth asphalt of the main highway and onto the pristine, crushed gravel driveway. A line of sleek black luxury sedans and European sports cars was already queuing for valet service, their polished surfaces reflecting the morning sun. My arrival was a jarring mechanical insult to the curated elegance of the environment. Before I even reached the primary barrier, 3 private security guards stepped out from the climate-controlled booth. They wore dark suits, dark sunglasses, and coiled earpieces, projecting the aggressive authority purchased by Gregory's fading wealth. The lead guard, a heavily built man with a tight, irritated jaw, walked directly into the center of the driveway, raising a flat palm to halt my advance. I brought the truck to a stop, the old brakes squealing sharply against the quiet morning air. I rolled down my manual window. The guard did not bother with a polite greeting. He leaned down, resting his hand aggressively against my doorframe, and sneered at the worn interior of my cab. He immediately instructed me to turn the vehicle around, explicitly stating that the service and delivery entrance was located 3 miles down the service road. I informed him I was not making a delivery. I told him I was here for the wedding. The guard let out a harsh, dismissive laugh. He pulled a digital tablet from his jacket pocket and tapped the screen mockingly, asking for a name he fully intended to reject. I gave him my name. He scrolled through the elite VIP guest roster, his smirk widening as he reached the bottom of the list. He shook his head, tapped the roof of my truck, and ordered me to clear the entrance before he called for a local tow truck. He stated clearly that I was not on the list and had absolutely no business being on the property. I did not raise my voice or attempt to argue with his manufactured authority. Arguing is the desperate tactic of a man who lacks leverage. I calmly reached across the cracked vinyl of the passenger seat and opened my heavy leather briefcase. I pulled out a single thick sheet of paper. It was not a printed wedding invitation or a desperate plea for access. It was a fully notarized, legally binding declaration of absolute ownership, stamped with the raised seal of the state treasury and verified by the Supreme Court of Corporate Commerce. I held the document out the window, keeping my expression entirely flat. The guard sighed heavily, snatching the paper from my hand, with a theatrical display of extreme annoyance, fully prepared to physically remove me if I resisted. He glanced at the top paragraph, his mouth opening to issue another harsh command. Instead, his eyes locked onto the bold legal text. I watched the arrogant smirk melt off his face in real time. The color completely drained from his cheeks, leaving him a pale, trembling mess. He read the federal tax identification numbers, the primary corporate trust signatures, and the explicit operational directives that granted the bearer absolute, unquestioned sovereignty over the entire commercial premises. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically from the heavy legal seal directly to my face. The power dynamic shifted with the brutal, instantaneous force of a physical blow. The man who had just threatened to tow my vehicle suddenly realized he had just threatened the absolute owner of the ground he was currently standing on. He stammered frantically, attempting to form an apology, his hands visibly shaking, as he returned the document to me with extreme reverence. I took the paper back and placed it meticulously inside my briefcase. I did not accept his apology. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered a single quiet command to open the gates immediately. The guard scrambled backward, nearly tripping over his own expensive shoes as he frantically waved to his subordinates inside the climate-controlled booth. The massive iron gates groaned and swung wide open, parting obediently for my rusted truck. I put the engine in gear and drove slowly through the fortified checkpoint, leaving the deeply terrified security team completely paralyzed in my rearview mirror. The tires of my truck crunched loudly against the pristine gravel as I navigated the winding tree-lined avenue leading toward the main estate. Jordan and Meredith had chosen this specific, ultra-exclusive botanical garden for their wedding precisely because it was widely considered the most expensive, unattainable venue in the entire state. Gregory had undoubtedly leveraged his fading social connections to secure the booking, desperate to project an illusion of unbreakable wealth to his high society guests. What none of them knew was the true nature of the property's financial structure. Decades ago, during a massive commercial real estate collapse, my primary blind trust aggressively purchased the entire 300-acre parcel of land out of foreclosure. The Botanical Garden Foundation did not own a single blade of grass on this estate. They held a strict, heavily monitored lease agreement directly with my corporate holding company. Every month, they deposited a massive rent payment into the very trust fund Gregory was currently trying to steal. I was not an uninvited guest crashing a private party. I was the supreme, indisputable landlord of the entire operation. Gregory had completely bankrupted his failing hedge fund to rent a spectacular stage, completely unaware he was paying for the privilege of dancing in my backyard. I bypassed the chaotic valet station entirely and parked my battered truck directly between a gleaming silver Bentley and a customized black Porsche. I stepped out of the vehicle, the crisp charcoal wool of my bespoke suit, cutting a sharp, intimidating figure against the morning light. I grabbed my briefcase and walked steadily toward the towering, arched glass doors of the grand marble foyer. Inside, the venue was already a hive of frantic, high-end activity. Event coordinators shouted quiet, urgent orders while florists desperately arranged massive cascades of imported white roses across the grand staircases. I ignored the chaos, letting my eyes sweep the vast perimeter of the entry hall. I found them almost immediately. Standing in the deep shadows near a brass-plated service elevator were three massive, heavily muscled men. They wore sterile, unmarked medical scrubs that stretched tightly across their broad chests. They were attempting to blend into the background, masquerading as venue staff, but their aggressive, rigid posture gave them away entirely. They were not here to arrange flowers or carry champagne flutes. One of the men held a heavy folded canvas bundle loosely against his thigh. I recognized the thick, reinforced straps and heavy metal buckles instantly. It was a medical-grade straitjacket. This was the extraction team Jordan had arranged. They were waiting for a frail, confused old man to wander into their carefully laid trap so they could drag him quietly into the service elevator and lock him away in a psychiatric ward forever. I did not pause. I did not turn around to seek an alternative route. I tightened my grip on the handle of my briefcase, locked my eyes directly onto the lead transport guard, and marched straight toward them. I maintained my steady, unbroken stride across the polished marble floor of the grand foyer, heading directly on a collision course with the three heavily muscled men clutching their canvas straitjacket. They spotted me approaching and immediately tensed, shifting their weight and preparing to execute Jordan's ruthless abduction order right in front of the sweeping, expensive floral arrangements. Before they could take a single aggressive step forward, the estate's general manager intercepted my path. He was a sharply dressed, frantic man, carrying a clipboard and barking logistical orders into a handheld radio. I reached into my coat pocket and bypassed the customary venue pleasantries entirely. I handed him the exact same notarized declaration of supreme ownership that had just paralyzed his front gate security detail. The manager froze mid-sentence, his mouth hanging slightly open in pure shock. He read the heavy black text, the raised state treasury seal, and the explicit corporate directives naming my blind trust as the absolute landlord of the entire 300-acre botanical property. He looked up at me, his face instantly morphing from a stressed event coordinator to a terrified, obedient subordinate. I did not raise my voice or cause a public scene. I leaned in close and quietly instructed him to deal with the three thugs masquerading as his medical staff. I told him with absolute cold clarity that if those men took one more step toward the main event space, I would immediately terminate his entire operating lease before the first course was served, effectively bankrupting his venue management company by nightfall. The manager swallowed hard, completely abandoning his radio and his clipboard. He turned violently toward the transport team, using his ultimate authority over the physical venue to corner them. He ordered them to step back into the service corridor immediately, threatening to call the local police and have them arrested for criminal trespassing if they resisted his command. The thugs, visibly confused by the sudden loss of their operational cover and lacking any real authority of their own, backed away into the shadows of the hallway. I did not stay to watch them retreat in defeat. I bypassed the heavily guarded VIP stairwell and walked directly to the primary glass elevator restricted solely for the bridal party. I pressed the call button and rode silently up to the penthouse bridal suite, the heavy doors closing on the chaos below. The heavy oak double doors leading into the penthouse were polished to a mirror finish and guarded by absolute silence. I did not knock. I did not pause to announce my arrival or wait for an invitation to enter the space my son falsely believed he owned. I simply pressed both hands against the solid wood and pushed the doors wide open, allowing them to slam loudly against the interior walls. The bridal suite was a sprawling, opulent monument to excess filled with towering arrangements of white orchids, velvet chaise lounges, and massive gilded mirrors reflecting the morning light. Meredith stood directly in the center of the room, surrounded by the glittering debris of her wedding preparations. She was admiring a blindingly bright diamond tiara, adjusting it carefully against her intricate, expensive hairstyle. Jordan stood near a crystal decanter cart, pouring himself a heavy glass of single malt scotch to calm his nerves before the supposed psychiatric abduction took place. The sudden violent sound of the oak doors hitting the walls caused them both to jump in sheer terror. Jordan spun around, spilling amber liquid across the pristine white carpet. Meredith gasped loudly, dropping her hands from her tiara, the color completely drained from both of their faces. They stared at me with absolute, unadulterated disbelief. They fully expected a confused, broken old man dragged into the room by muscular orderlies in a canvas restraint. Instead, they found me standing tall and completely unrestricted in the center of their private sanctuary. The bespoke charcoal suit I wore commanded immediate, undeniable visual authority. The premium fabric, the flawless cut, the precise tailoring radiated a cold, lethal power that entirely dwarfed the rented luxury of the suite. Jordan's eyes darted frantically over my pearl buttons, my crimson tie and the heavy gold cufflinks flashing fiercely under the chandelier. He could not process the visual data presenting itself. His brain fractured, trying to reconcile the pathetic, destitute father he had mocked with the imposing, ruthless corporate titan currently standing in his bridal suite. I stepped fully into the room and let the heavy oak doors swing gently shut behind me, sealing us together in the tense, suffocating silence. I did not smile. I did not offer a fatherly greeting. I stood perfectly still, letting the heavy reality of my physical presence completely crush the false security they had built. For years, Jordan had operated under a catastrophic misunderstanding of how the world actually worked. He genuinely believed that his close proximity to Meredith's generational white wealth somehow granted him an impenetrable shield of invincibility. He equated elite country club memberships, imported luxury cars, and designer labels with true lasting authority. He grew up watching me drive a rusted delivery truck, eat simple meals, and work quietly in the background, assuming my intentional lack of ostentatious display was a symptom of total financial failure and mental stagnation. He never understood the fundamental difference between looking wealthy and actually possessing the absolute unyielding capital required to bend the world entirely to your will. True power does not seek external validation through diamond tiaras or vintage scotch. True power operates in total silence, building ironclad blind trusts and massive logistics empires that remain entirely invisible until the exact moment they are unleashed upon an enemy. Jordan had worshipped the glittering fragile surface of Gregory's hollow empire, completely blind to the lethal deep-water predator swimming silently right beneath his feet. He thought he was playing a sophisticated game of corporate chess against a senile amateur. He forgot that the man who raised him literally wrote the rulebook on ruthless survival during the most vicious corporate raiding eras in modern history. Jordan's initial shock rapidly mutated into blind, panicked desperation. He dropped his heavy crystal tumbler onto the floor, completely ignoring the shattering glass, and frantically dug his cell phone out of his tailored tuxedo pocket. He began dialing the private numbers of the psychiatric transport team, desperately expecting them to rush into the suite and execute the ambush he had paid so much money to arrange. The phone rang endlessly on speaker, completely ignored by the men currently locked away in the downstairs service corridor. Jordan then dialed the main security desk, his fingers shaking violently against the screen, but those calls went entirely unanswered as well. His invisible army had evaporated into thin air. Meredith, however, remained completely anchored in her own arrogant delusion. She watched Jordan panic and let out a sharp, patronizing laugh that echoed terribly across the quiet suite. She stepped forward, adjusting the bodice of her silk gown, completely convinced she understood the dynamic of the room. She looked at my expensive suit and entirely misinterpreted its meaning. She assumed I had spent the last remaining dollars of my depleted checking account to rent a costume, hoping to look presentable while begging my son for mercy. She smiled with toxic superiority, insulting my intelligence by stating that dressing up would not change the legal reality of the fraudulent loan or the stolen medical proxy. She proudly proclaimed that the game was officially over and that I had lost everything I ever owned. She mocked the very idea that I could step into her elite world and demand any level of respect. She pointed a manicured, diamond-clad finger at the marble coffee table and sharply ordered me to leave the keys to my own stolen house right there before security finally arrived to escort me away. She demanded my total, unconditional surrender, utterly convinced I was holding a briefcase full of desperate, useless apologies. I looked at her pointing finger, listened to her arrogant demands, and felt the cold, satisfying thrill of the trap snapping completely and irreversibly shut. I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I did not dignify her demands with a single word of argument. I simply unlatched the heavy brass locks of my leather briefcase. The crisp snap of the metal mechanisms echoed loudly in the cavernous suite, momentarily stalling her tirade. I reached inside and retrieved a thick stack of legal documents securely bound in a heavy crimson folio. I took 2 measured steps forward, completely ignoring Meredith's outraged gasp, and dropped the heavy file directly onto her silk-draped lap. The sheer weight of the paper forced the breath from her lungs. I turned my absolute focus to Jordan. He was practically vibrating with nervous energy, his eyes darting frantically between the suite door and the phone still clutched in his sweaty palm. I ordered him to approach his bride and read the top page of that file aloud. I did not raise my voice, but the tone I used was the exact same commanding cadence I utilized to break striking union bosses and dismantle hostile corporate raiders. It left absolutely no room for defiance. Jordan swallowed hard, the Adam's apple bobbing sharply in his throat. He took a hesitant, trembling step toward Meredith, who was staring at the documents as if I had just handed her a live explosive. He reached down and pulled the top page from the crimson folio. His eyes frantically scanned the dense legal text, desperately searching for the eviction notice or the desperate restraining order they had arrogantly assumed I was delivering. Instead, his gaze caught the bold, undeniable letterhead of the Cayman Island Shadow Bank. I watched the initial confusion wash over his face rapidly, replaced by a creeping, suffocating terror as he processed the numbers printed in stark black ink. I commanded him again to read the text aloud, so his soon-to-be wife could fully understand the exact financial foundation of their marriage. Jordan opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He tried again, his voice trembling so violently that the heavy parchment rattled in his grip. He began to read the debt restructuring agreement, stumbling over the complex financial terminology. He read the clauses explicitly detailing the $2 million offshore loan he had illegally secured using my stolen identity and the forged medical proxy. He read the specific addendum Mitchell had expertly manipulated just hours ago. The color completely vanished from Jordan's face as he reached the absolute core of the document. He finally realized the devastating truth. The massive luxury mansion he and Meredith had just purchased, the extravagant destination wedding, the designer clothes, and the imported cars were all funded by a loan that no longer possessed any corporate shielding. The document undeniably proved that Mitchell had legally severed my logistics company from the lien, actively rerouting the entire burden of the $2 million debt directly onto Jordan and Meredith's personal marital estate. Jordan choked on the words as he reached the creditor information. He read the name of the shadow corporation that had outright purchased the debt from the Cayman Bank. He slowly looked up from the paper, his eyes wide with absolute horror, as he finally understood that the shadow corporation belonged entirely to my primary blind trust. I was now their sole merciless creditor. They did not own the mansion. They did not own the cars. They personally owed me $2 million at a predatory compounding interest rate that was mathematically impossible for them to ever repay. The stolen operational liquidity they had drained from my checking account was completely exhausted on wedding deposits. They were instantly and catastrophically bankrupt. Meredith snatched the paper from his trembling hands, her diamond tiara slipping sideways as she furiously scanned the text. She refused to believe the trap had closed. She shrieked that the document was a forgery, a desperate trick played by a pathetic old man. Jordan did not join her denial. His knees buckled slightly, and he collapsed onto the edge of a velvet chaise lounge, the realization of his total financial annihilation, crushing the breath out of him. He knew the paperwork was flawlessly executed because it mirrored the exact ruthless precision he had witnessed me use against my competitors for his entire life. When Jordan was 18 years old, I spent countless weekends sitting at our scarred kitchen table attempting to teach him the fundamental architecture of a corporate financial ledger. I wanted him to understand how debt could be weaponized, how compound interest could either build an empire or completely enslave a man. I placed the raw, bleeding data of my logistics company in front of him, begging him to learn the unglamorous mechanics of true wealth. Jordan arrogantly skipped those lessons. He complained that reading spreadsheets was beneath him, claiming he was destined to be a visionary, not a miserable accountant. He chose the glittering illusion of high society over the gritty, unforgiving reality of actual capital. His willful ignorance had ultimately sealed his absolute destruction. If he had possessed even a basic understanding of corporate finance, he would have instantly recognized the lethal indemnity clauses hidden deep within the boilerplate text of the offshore loan he signed. Instead, he blindly signed his own financial death warrant, completely unaware that he was handing me the exact weapon required to execute his total ruin. The suffocating silence of the bridal suite was suddenly shattered by the heavy oak doors banging open a second time. Gregory stormed into the room, his face flushed a dark, angry purple. He wore a tuxedo jacket draped aggressively over his arm, completely bypassing the joyful demeanor of a proud father on his daughter's wedding day. He marched directly toward me, pointing a thick finger at my chest, loudly demanding that I leave the premises immediately. He boasted that his security team had finally managed to regroup downstairs and were currently marching up the stairs to forcibly remove me. I did not retreat a single inch. I reached back into my leather briefcase and retrieved a secondary, significantly thinner file. I silently held it out to him. Gregory snatched it from my hand, his mouth already forming a fresh string of venomous threats. He ripped open the file and glared at the single sheet of paper inside. It was a digital receipt confirming the massive, irrevocable transfer of his entire hedge fund liquidity. I watched the aggressive fury drain entirely from his face, instantly replaced by a hollow, sickening terror. The document explicitly confirmed that the internal financial projections he had based his desperate buyout on were entirely fabricated. He had just diverted the absolute last remaining capital of his legacy to purchase a mountain of worthless, non-existent corporate debt. His hedge fund was instantly and completely ruined. Gregory's legs gave out. He collapsed heavily into a gilded chair beside his daughter, the paper slipping from his lifeless fingers. The men who sought to bury me were now completely entombed in their own greed. The heavy oak doors of the bridal suite remained firmly shut, sealing the four of us inside a tomb of shattered ambition. I turned my back on Gregory's hyperventilating form and Jordan's paralyzed silhouette. I walked directly to the massive floor-to-ceiling bay windows that offered a commanding panoramic view of the sprawling botanical gardens below. The perfectly manicured lower lawn was a sea of pastel silk and dark designer suits. 300 of the city's most elite influential figures sat in perfectly aligned rows of white wooden chairs. They whispered among themselves, fanning their faces with custom-printed programs, completely oblivious to the catastrophic financial slaughter that had just occurred 3 stories above their heads. Suddenly, the venue's massive, state-of-the-art outdoor acoustic system hummed to life. The traditional swelling chords of the wedding march began to echo across the manicured hedges and reflecting pools, signaling the imminent arrival of a bride who was currently bankrupt and hyperventilating behind me. I reached into my tailored jacket pocket and retrieved my cell phone. When my holding company structured the leasing agreement for this estate decades ago, we mandated absolute unrestricted digital access to every central server on the property to strictly monitor our asset. I opened a specialized application and inputted my alphanumeric landlord override code. The network did not resist my intrusion. I instantly bypassed the catering company's temporary firewalls and locked out the venue manager's operational control dashboard. I now possessed total unilateral command over the entire estate's audiovisual network. Down below, the wedding march continued its triumphant crescendo, vibrating through the massive directional speakers concealed within the garden's intricate architecture. I raised my phone, selected the encrypted audio file Mitchell had transmitted from Dr. Thorne's concealed wire, and prepared to deliver the final, inescapable verdict directly to their high society audience. I pressed a single digital icon on my screen, entirely severing the audio feed from the main control booth below. The triumphant wedding march died instantly, replaced by a sudden jarring burst of static that snapped the attention of every single guest on the lawn. The 300 attendees shifted in their seats, exchanging confused, irritated glances, expecting a rapid technical correction from the hired staff. Instead, they received a pristine, digitally enhanced broadcast of absolute betrayal. The venue's massive outdoor speakers crackled, and then Gregory's deep, booming voice thundered across the botanical gardens. The audio quality of the sophisticated transmission wire was flawless. Every patron sitting on the lawn clearly heard Gregory proudly outline his intent to use a fabricated medical diagnosis to systematically liquidate my logistics company to save his own sinking hedge fund. I watched the sea of wealthy guests stiffen in collective shock. Then Meredith's sharp, condescending voice pierced the morning air. The speakers broadcasted her vicious mockery of my supposed poverty, followed immediately by her explicit instructions on how to effectively lock me away in a secure psychiatric facility without raising suspicion from the state medical authorities. Jordan's voice joined the chorus next, explicitly confirming the forged medical proxy and laughing about how easily he had manipulated the system to steal my personal checking account to fund the very wedding these guests were currently attending. The private, sinister conspiracy they had hatched in the shadows was now being blasted at maximum volume across 300 acres of premium real estate. Up in the bridal suite, the sheer volume of the outdoor broadcast rattled the thick window panes. Meredith let out a guttural shriek of pure horror, throwing her hands over her ears as if she could physically block out the sound of her own criminal confession. Jordan scrambled toward the window, his eyes wide with a frantic animalistic terror as he looked down at his entire social circle, listening to his unforgivable treachery. Gregory remained slumped in his chair, his ruined hedge fund and his ruined reputation crashing down upon him simultaneously. They could not stop the transmission. They could not unplug the speakers. They were forced to listen to their own voices, permanently destroying their lives in front of everyone they had ever sought to impress. I stood completely still by the window, watching the chaos unfold below, with absolute, unwavering detachment. My late wife, Cecilia, was a woman of profound, quiet wisdom. She despised the frantic, performative nature of the corporate elite, preferring the steady, undeniable reality of hard work and honest ledgers. Years ago, when I faced a particularly vicious smear campaign from a desperate competitor trying to steal a massive shipping contract, I considered fighting back with aggressive, equally deceptive tactics. Cecilia placed her hand over mine and stopped me. She firmly believed that lies require constant, exhausting maintenance, but the truth operates independently. She told me that the truth requires absolutely no defense, no spin, and no complex public relations strategy. She promised me that the truth only ever requires a loud enough microphone. I never forgot her quiet directive. Today, I was honoring her memory by providing the loudest possible microphone for my son's deceit. I did not need to scream, hurl insults, or desperately defend my own sanity to the people below. I simply handed their own treacherous words a massive acoustic platform, letting their unchecked arrogance act as the undisputed prosecutor, judge, and executioner. The unvarnished facts carried their own undeniable weight, shattering the pristine facade they had spent a fortune to build. The reaction on the lawn was immediate and entirely catastrophic. The initial stunned silence fractured into an absolute uproar of disgust and outrage. Wealthy socialites gasped in pure horror, covering their mouths as the brutal reality of the elder abuse and corporate theft echoed over the immaculate hedges. Several prominent local judges and politicians, men who could not afford to be legally adjacent to a massive federal fraud conspiracy, immediately stood up and marched briskly toward the valet station. The shocked murmurs rapidly escalated into angry shouts of condemnation. Down in the marble foyer, the acoustic reverberations of the broadcast penetrated the thick walls. The three heavily muscled men in medical scrubs who had been waiting in the service corridor to execute my abduction heard the explicit, undeniable confession, detailing their role in a forged medical kidnapping. These were mercenary operatives paid to handle discreet extractions, not loyal soldiers willing to absorb a federal kidnapping and fraud indictment for a newly bankrupt hedge fund manager. I watched through the internal security feed on my phone as the realization of their extreme legal jeopardy hit them simultaneously. They did not hesitate to save themselves. The lead operative aggressively shoved the heavy canvas straitjacket into a nearby laundry cart, furiously wiping his fingerprints from the leather buckles. Without a single backward glance, the psychiatric transport team sprinted out the rear service doors, abandoning the sinking ship and vanishing into the dense tree line to avoid the imminent police response. Jordan watched the mass exodus of his elite guests from the penthouse window, his breathing shallow and rapid as the crowd abandoned the venue in droves. He slowly turned his head to look at me, the final realization of his absolute inescapable isolation settling into his terrified eyes. The panicked exodus of high society was abruptly halted by a sound entirely foreign to the exclusive botanical gardens. A sharp, piercing wail of heavy sirens sliced through the crisp morning air, rapidly growing in volume and intensity. The noise bounced off the manicured hedges and echoed against the marble facades, completely drowning out the frantic murmurs of the fleeing guests. I stood by the penthouse window and watched the absolute destruction of Jordan and Meredith's perfect day physically manifest on the driveway below. 5 matte black, heavily armored SUVs tore off the main highway, entirely ignoring the velvet ropes of the valet station. The heavy vehicles skidded violently across the pristine crushed gravel, spraying white stones over the meticulously arranged floral borders. The doors of the lad vehicles flew open before the tires had even fully stopped moving. Federal agents poured out their dark windbreakers emblazoned with stark yellow lettering. They moved with a terrifying synchronized precision, fanning out across the property to secure the perimeter. Mitchell had executed the final stage of our operation flawlessly. He had not simply handed my evidence to a local precinct desk jockey. He had bypassed the corruptible county systems entirely and delivered the undeniable proof of wire fraud and medical conspiracy directly to a federal strike team hungry for a high-profile white-collar bust. I watched the agents set up tactical checkpoints, completely locking down the estate. The wealthy guests, who had been rushing for their luxury sedans, were now trapped behind a wall of federal authority, forced to witness the criminal raid of the decade. The flashing red and blue lights painted the white wedding chairs in harsh, strobing colors. Up in the bridal suite, the distant wail of the sirens finally registered over the ringing silence of the room. Meredith pressed her hands against the glass, her breath fogging the window pane as she stared down at the federal convoy. She began to back away slowly, her eyes wide with a frantic, inescapable panic. The trap had not merely closed. The trap was now heavily armed and fully occupied. The heavy footfalls of the federal strike team echoed loudly up the grand marble staircase, completely bypassing the stalled VIP elevators. I turned away from the window and faced the room. Jordan was frozen, his mouth opening and closing, as he failed to form a single coherent sentence. Gregory, suddenly snapping out of his catatonic shock, scrambled out of his gilded chair. His survival instincts, honed by decades of corporate manipulation, flared to life. He aggressively patted down his tuxedo jacket, frantically searching for his mobile phone. He intended to call his bought and paid-for state politicians, the judges he sponsored, and the police commissioners he funded. He genuinely believed that a few frantic phone calls could somehow halt a federal raid. He was operating on the outdated assumption that his wealth still functioned as a universal shield against consequence. The heavy oak doors of the penthouse bridal suite did not swing open gracefully this time. They were kicked wide open, slamming violently against the floral arrangements. 4 federal agents stormed into the room, their expressions hard and unyielding. They immediately secured the exits, positioning themselves in front of the doorways, with their hands resting casually near their tactical belts. The lead agent, a tall woman with steel-gray eyes and a sharp jawline, stepped into the center of the room. She swept her gaze over the extravagant decor before locking eyes with Gregory. Gregory raised his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen, and loudly demanded to know the meaning of this intrusion. He shouted that he was a personal friend of the governor and that every agent in the room would be unemployed by sunset if they did not immediately vacate the premises. The lead agent did not flinch. She did not entertain his arrogant posturing. She closed the distance between them in 2 rapid strides and snatched the mobile phone directly out of his hand. Gregory gasped in sheer outrage, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. The agent coldly informed him that the device was now officially classified as federal evidence in an ongoing criminal investigation. She instructed him to step back and keep his hands entirely visible. Gregory opened his mouth to deliver another threat, but the sheer terrifying reality of the federal presence finally crushed his bravado. He stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of a velvet lounge, completely stripped of his power, his influence, and his communication with the outside world. Jordan watched the agent confiscate his father-in-law's phone, his entire body trembling violently. He looked at me, a profound, sickening realization settling over his features. Throughout his entire sheltered upbringing, I had attempted to instill a singular, unbreakable principle regarding conflict. I had warned him repeatedly that making empty threats was the absolute hallmark of a weak and foolish man. A threat without the immediate capacity for overwhelming execution is merely an invitation for your enemy to strike first. I never raised my voice in anger. I never promised destruction I could not instantly deliver. Whenever I engaged in a corporate battle, I operated in total silence until the exact moment I held undeniable, legally binding proof of my opponent's vulnerabilities. I ensured that by the time I finally spoke, the war was already mathematically decided. Jordan had ignored this philosophy entirely. He had brazenly threatened to lock me in a psychiatric ward, completely underestimating the lethal, meticulous retaliation I would unleash in response. I did not need to threaten him. I simply allowed the federal statutes and the unyielding weight of his own documented crimes to deliver the final verdict. The lead agent unzipped the front pocket of her tactical windbreaker and retrieved a thick stack of folded documents. She did not offer a polite greeting. She stepped directly toward the center of the room, positioning herself between the terrified bride and the bankrupt groom. She raised the paperwork and began to read the official charges aloud. Her voice was flat, mechanical, and utterly devoid of mercy. She announced the federal warrants for severe wire fraud, citing the illegal transfer of assets across international borders. She listed the charges of elder abuse and criminal conspiracy, detailing the explicit forgery of medical proxies and the premeditated intent to enact a fraudulent psychiatric hold. Finally, she stated the charge of grand larceny linking the stolen operational liquidity directly to the $2 million offshore loan. The sheer volume of the criminal charges hung heavily in the air, each word carrying the weight of a lengthy federal prison sentence. Meredith collapsed onto the floor, her silk wedding gown pooling around her as she began to hyperventilate. Jordan's remaining composure shattered completely. The arrogant, condescending heir who had mocked my worn clothing and simple life ceased to exist. He lunged forward, closing the distance between us, and fell heavily onto his knees. The sharp impact of his bones hitting the marble floor echoed loudly in the suite. He reached out with trembling, sweaty hands and desperately clutched the fabric of my charcoal trousers. Tears streamed down his face, ruining his perfectly groomed appearance. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with absolute primal terror, and begged his father to stop the arrest. He pleaded for mercy, sobbing that he had made a terrible mistake and promising to return everything he had stolen. I looked down at the weeping man clutching my trouser leg. He sobbed uncontrollably into the premium wool fabric, his tears leaving dark, pathetic stains against the immaculate tailoring of my bespoke suit. He begged me to call off the federal strike team, frantically promising that we could settle this quietly, as a family. Swearing that he would sign away everything if I just stopped the lead agent from placing him in handcuffs. The federal agents surrounding us remained perfectly still, their hands resting securely on their tactical belts, allowing the heavy, suffocating silence of the penthouse to amplify my son's pathetic sobbing. I searched my heart for a spark of paternal instinct, looking for the familiar surge of protective warmth that had dictated my every action for the past 30 years. I found absolutely nothing. There was no boiling rage. There was no profound sorrow. There was only a vast, chilling emptiness where my love for him used to reside. The man kneeling on the marble floor was a complete stranger who had stolen my identity, forged my medical records, and plotted to lock me in a psychiatric ward to fund his own vanity. I did not bend down to comfort him. I calmly took a deliberate, measured step backward, forcing his sweaty hands to slip off my trousers. Jordan hit the floor with his palms gasping for air as he looked up at me with wild, desperate eyes. I spoke with a voice entirely devoid of emotion, ensuring that every federal agent in the suite and every guest listening through the open doors could hear my exact words. I stated clearly that the boy I raised died the exact moment he signed a forged medical proxy to orchestrate my abduction. I declared to the federal authorities that I possessed no legal, moral, or biological connection to the criminal kneeling before me. I formally and completely disowned him. I instructed the lead agent that I would not offer any leniency, I would not post any bail, and I would testify against him in federal court to the maximum extent of the law. Jordan let out a guttural, agonizing cry, collapsing entirely against the floor as the absolute finality of my words crushed whatever remaining hope he possessed. The brutal reality of Jordan's total excommunication shattered the last remnants of Meredith's manufactured composure. She stared at her sobbing fiancé, then at the federal warrants resting on the coffee table, and finally at her father, who was currently slumped in a chair, staring blankly at the floor. Her entire empire of inherited wealth and social superiority had evaporated in less than 5 minutes. Driven by pure instinctual panic, she hiked up the heavy silk layers of her designer wedding gown, a dress that had cost more than an average family earns in a decade, paid for entirely by the fraudulent offshore loan she had happily helped secure. She lunged toward the heavy oak doors, intending to escape the suffocating suite and flee into the botanical gardens, leaving the financial wreckage entirely behind her. She did not make it past the threshold. The lead federal agent moved with terrifying speed, stepping laterally to block the exit and firmly planting a hand against Meredith's shoulder. The agent physically apprehended her, guiding her forcefully back into the center of the room and instructing her to remain perfectly still. Meredith fought against the agent's grip, her diamond tiara slipping off her hair and clattering loudly against the marble floor. The sharp sound of the falling diamonds seemed to sever her last tether to sanity. She began to scream. It was not a cry of sorrow, but a piercing, furious shriek of a woman who had just realized she was financially ruined and facing federal indictment. She violently turned on Jordan, her perfectly manicured nails curling into aggressive fists. She kicked at his legs as he remained curled on the floor, pointing an accusing finger at his tear-stained face. She shrieked to the federal agents that she was an innocent victim. She claimed with aggressive desperation that she was merely a naive bride who trusted her future husband with the finances, completely oblivious to his parasitic theft of an elderly man's estate. She shouted that Jordan had entirely manipulated her, orchestrating the entire criminal enterprise behind her back. She demanded an immediate annulled divorce, stating she would not spend a single day in federal prison for the pathetic ambitions of a bankrupt liar. Her voice echoed off the gilded mirrors, a toxic display of pure self-preservation. She was willing to completely destroy the man she was supposed to marry in a desperate, futile attempt to save her own skin. Jordan stared up at the woman he had risked federal prison to impress. He watched her aggressively hurl him to the federal wolves to save herself. For decades, I had attempted to shield him from the cutthroat nature of the world. I had provided an unconditional safety net, assuming my unwavering fatherly devotion would naturally instill a sense of honor and loyalty. I learned too late that a father's love is indeed unconditional, but a man's personal dignity must remain absolutely non-negotiable. By constantly protecting him from the consequences of his arrogance, I had bred a predator who viewed my compassion as a weakness to be exploited. Now I was delivering the final brutal lesson I should have taught him years ago. He was learning in real time that betrayal breeds nothing but betrayal. He had built his entire future on a foundation of lies and manipulation, partnering with a family that valued wealth above human life. The moment the capital vanished, the loyalty evaporated instantly. He had traded an honest father for a pack of hungry wolves, and now they were eagerly tearing him apart to survive. The heavy oak doors swung open one final time, breaking the tense standoff between the screaming bride and her broken groom. Mitchell walked briskly into the penthouse suite, his posture rigid and professional. He wore a sharp navy suit and carried a thick metal clipboard, moving past the federal agents with the practiced ease of a man who held top-tier security clearance. He did not acknowledge Gregory's catatonic stare or Meredith's hysterical sobbing. He walked directly to my side and stopped, offering a sharp, respectful nod. He turned the metal clipboard toward me. Clipped to the front was a single heavily redacted sheet of legal parchment bearing the official seal of the International Banking Authority. Mitchell spoke in a clear, carrying voice, officially announcing that the final stage of the asset reclamation protocol was fully authorized. He handed me the final, unappealable execution order for the defaulted $2 million offshore loan. The document granted me the absolute legal right to instantly liquidate every single remaining asset Jordan and Meredith possessed. I had the power to seize their bank accounts, repossess their vehicles, and forcefully auction the very clothes they were wearing to satisfy the compounding interest of their stolen debt. I took the heavy pen Mitchell offered and pressed the silver tip against the bottom signature line. The scratching sound of the ink against the paper was the loudest noise in the room. With a single fluid motion, I signed the document, permanently locking the jaws of the trap. The financial slaughter was now a matter of public federal record. I handed the clipboard back to Mitchell, turned my back on the people who had tried to bury me, and prepared to watch the federal agents drag them all away in handcuffs. I capped the heavy gold pen and let the profound silence of the room absorb the absolute finality of my action. That single fluid stroke of ink across the parchment triggered an automated, irrevocable cascade of financial liquidation. Mitchell immediately tapped a confirmation command into his encrypted tablet, linking directly to our Shadow Bank's Asset Recovery Division. In a matter of seconds, Jordan and Meredith were officially stripped of every single material possession they had fraudulently acquired. I informed them precisely what was happening in real time, my voice entirely devoid of sympathy. The digital locks on their joint bank accounts were frozen and drained to zero, the seized funds instantly rerouted to satisfy the compounding penalties of their defaulted loan. The luxury sports cars they had proudly parked in the venue's VIP lot were legally repossessed, their electronic ignitions permanently disabled by the dealership at our direct corporate command. The escrow accounts holding the massive deposits for their lavish honeymoon to the Maldives were intercepted and entirely liquidated. Meredith stared at me, completely unable to process the terrifying velocity of her total ruin. She reached instinctively for her designer handbag, resting on the velvet chaise lounge, desperately hoping to salvage her platinum credit cards. The lead federal agent stepped forward and firmly confiscated the bag, classifying it as an asset procured through federal wire fraud. Jordan remained kneeling on the cold marble floor, his shoulders shaking as the crushing weight of his new reality paralyzed his vocal cords. He had spent his entire adult life frantically accumulating the expensive armor of the elite class, believing that stolen wealth equated to invulnerability. Now he was entirely exposed, a bankrupt fraud completely dispossessed of his cars, his accounts, and his future. The staggering $2 million debt had successfully swallowed his entire fabricated existence, leaving him with absolutely nothing but the rented tuxedo on his back and the immediate prospect of a lengthy federal prison sentence. I watched the realization extinguish the absolute last flicker of arrogance in his eyes. The financial execution was flawless, absolute, and entirely irreversible. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the manicured grounds of the botanical garden had descended into absolute, unmitigated panic. The 300 elite guests who had gathered to celebrate the union of two prominent families were now stampeding toward the exit in a frantic, undignified exodus. The wailing sirens of the federal strike team had effectively shattered the pristine illusion of the afternoon, replacing the elegant wedding march with the terrifying acoustics of a major law enforcement raid. Wealthy socialites, corporate executives, and local politicians abandoned their velvet-cushioned chairs, hiking up their expensive silk gowns and tailored trousers to sprint across the immaculate lawns. They were desperate to reach their luxury vehicles before the authorities initiated a total lockdown of the premises. Nobody wanted their name or their license plate associated with a highly publicized federal fraud and elder abuse raid. The meticulously arranged ceremony space dissolved into a chaotic, trampled wasteland of discarded event programs and crushed white orchids. The venue managers, previously paralyzed by my ownership directives, were now actively assisting the federal agents in securing the perimeter, sealing the heavy iron gates to prevent any potential co-conspirators from slipping away undetected. Flashing red and blue emergency lights painted the pristine white floral arches in harsh, violent strokes, transforming the opulent wedding venue into an active, highly restricted crime scene. The string quartet hired to provide elegant background music had packed their instruments and fled, leaving behind overturned music stands on the manicured grass. The massive catering tents were swiftly commandeered by federal investigators, who began aggressively cataloging evidence and detaining the venue coordinators for questioning. Gregory's high society associates did not linger to offer their emotional support or defend his ruined honor. They abandoned him with ruthless efficiency, speeding away in their European sedans and leaving behind thick clouds of dust on the crushed gravel driveway. The elite social circle that Jordan had sacrificed his soul to infiltrate proved to be entirely hollow. They scattered at the absolute first sign of genuine consequence, prioritizing their own reputations over any fabricated bond of friendship. The sprawling botanical garden, booked at astronomical expense to host the social event of the season, now hosted nothing but federal authorities and the physical wreckage of a destroyed dynasty. I stood by the glass watching the taillights of the retreating luxury cars disappear down the main highway. I knew the unforgiving mechanics of high society intimately. It is an ecosystem entirely devoid of loyalty, governed exclusively by a brutal, unspoken ledger of power and utility. They only respect undeniable winners. The moment a man loses his capital, he loses his fundamental right to exist within their insulated world. For years, I warned Jordan that these people did not actually love him. They merely tolerated his presence because he offered them a convenient reflection of their own vanity. He aggressively dismissed my warnings, convinced his borrowed status made him an equal player in their gilded arena. He fundamentally failed to understand that the elite class operates like a pack of wolves, instantly turning on the weakest member the moment blood hits the water. A father's love is unconditional, but a man's dignity is non-negotiable. I had finally taught Jordan the hardest lesson of all, proving that betrayal breeds nothing but betrayal. Now entirely penniless and facing a massive federal indictment, Jordan instantly became a social leper. His aggressive climb up the social ladder had ended in a fatal, catastrophic plunge. The lead federal agent issued a sharp, decisive command to her tactical unit. Two heavily armored officers stepped forward and firmly gripped Jordan by the shoulders of his tailored tuxedo jacket. They forcefully hoisted him to his feet, entirely ignoring his weak physical resistance. A second pair of agents flanked Meredith, grabbing her arms and pulling her upright as she continued to thrash and shriek accusations at her paralyzed father. The cold metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs echoed sharply through the bridal suite as the agents secured their wrists tightly behind their backs. The physical restraints finalized the complete eradication of their elite status. They were no longer the wealthy hosts, aunts of a grand society wedding. They were federal suspects being processed for transport. The officers forcefully spun them around and began marching them toward the suite's open oak doors. The walk of shame commenced under the harsh glare of the chandelier. Meredith stumbled in her heavy silk gown, weeping hysterically as the agents marched her out into the hallway. Jordan dragged his feet, his breathing shallow and rapid. As he reached the threshold of the elevator bank, he dug his polished shoes into the carpet and twisted his torso violently against the agent's grip. He turned his head and looked back into the suite, his tear-streaked face contorted in absolute primal desperation. His eyes locked onto mine, silently begging for the fatherly salvation I had provided his entire life. He waited for me to intervene, to pay his bail, to shield him from the terrifying reality of his own actions. I looked at the broken, handcuffed man standing in the doorway. I felt absolutely nothing. I turned my back to the door and walked quietly toward the window, letting the heavy steel doors of the elevator close entirely on his weeping face. The heavy steel doors of the elevator glided shut, sealing away the final, pathetic echoes of my son's desperate pleas. I remained standing in the penthouse for a few moments, letting the profound silence of the empty suite wash over me. The frantic energy of the federal raid had completely evaporated, leaving behind a profound stillness. I picked up my leather briefcase, walked out of the bridal suite, and made my way down the grand marble staircase. The sprawling botanical garden estate, which just an hour ago had been teeming with 300 elite guests and heavily armed federal agents, was now entirely deserted. The fleet of black armored SUVs was gone, taking with them the architects of my attempted destruction. I walked through the towering glass doors and entered the main reception hall. The massive climate-controlled pavilion was a monument to interrupted vanity. Hundreds of crystal champagne flutes stood untouched on pristine white linen tablecloths, the expensive bubbles slowly going flat. Elaborate centerpieces of imported white roses and rare orchids were already beginning to wither under the afternoon sun, their petals curling and browning at the edges. Platter upon platter of untouched caviar and gourmet hors d'oeuvres sat spoiling in the quiet heat. The opulent 5-tier wedding cake sat perfectly intact on a silver pedestal, a ridiculous confectionery tower, waiting for a celebration that would never occur. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my leather shoes clicking softly against the polished hardwood floor. I reached the elevated head table designed to showcase Jordan and Meredith to their high society audience. I pulled back the heavy velvet cushioned chair intended for the groom and sat down. I placed my briefcase on the table next to a set of unused gold-plated silverware. I looked out over the vast sea of empty chairs. There was no anger left in my chest. There was no sorrow clouding my vision. The quiet room offered a stark, undeniable physical manifestation of the reality I had just engineered. The glittering artificial world Jordan had sacrificed his soul to inherit had been entirely dismantled, leaving nothing but abandoned crystal and absolute silence. The rhythmic sound of measured footsteps echoed from the far end of the reception hall. I did not turn my head. I knew the cadence perfectly. Mitchell walked down the center aisle, moving with the same relaxed professional efficiency he had displayed during the entire operation. He did not carry his metal clipboard or his encrypted tablet. Instead, he held a heavy square-shouldered bottle of premium aged bourbon and 2 heavy crystal tumblers he had undoubtedly procured from the venue's abandoned luxury bar. He reached the head table and set the glasses down onto the pristine white linen. He uncorked the bottle, the rich smoky aroma of the liquor instantly cutting through the cloying scent of the dying roses. Mitchell poured 2 generous measures, the amber liquid splashing smoothly against the crystal. He handed one glass to me and kept the other for himself. We did not offer a cheerful toast. We did not smile or engage in any triumphant celebration over the ruined lives of my enemies. We simply acknowledged the flawless execution of a perfectly designed strategy. Mitchell took the seat originally designated for Meredith's father. He looked out over the empty pavilion, took a slow sip of his bourbon, and delivered his final operational report. He confirmed that the federal strike team had successfully processed Jordan and Meredith into central holding without incident. He then detailed the swift catastrophic action taken by the Securities and Exchange Commission against Gregory. The moment Gregory's fabricated liquidity transfer hit the federal wire, the SEC immediately triggered a total asset freeze. Gregory's entire hedge fund, his personal accounts, his corporate real estate holdings, and his offshore safety nets were completely seized by the government. He was currently sitting in a federal interrogation room, completely stripped of his wealth, facing decades in a maximum security penitentiary for masterminding a massive wire fraud conspiracy. The surgical precision of our retaliation had left absolutely no collateral damage. We had not engaged in a messy public screaming match. We had simply utilized the unforgiving mechanics of corporate law and federal oversight to completely excise a malignant tumor from my life. The parasites who had attempted to consume my legacy were now entirely locked inside a federal cage they had built with their own unparalleled greed. I took a slow sip of the bourbon, feeling the sharp, warm burn settle in my chest. Sitting in the vast, empty opulence of the botanical garden pavilion, I felt a deep, resonant connection to the man I was, before the wealth, before the logistics empire, and long before the profound betrayal of my only son. I built my life from absolutely nothing. I started with a single rusted delivery van, calloused hands, and an unbreakable willingness to endure the grueling, silent exhaustion of honest labor. I spent decades working in the freezing quiet hours before dawn, calculating shipping routes under flickering warehouse bulbs, repairing diesel engines, and securing unglamorous corporate contracts while my competitors slept. I did not fear the quiet. I embraced it. Silence was the very foundation upon which I constructed my entire existence. Jordan had viewed my preference for solitude as a weakness, interpreting my quiet, unassuming lifestyle as evidence of a small, pathetic mind. He failed to comprehend that a man who builds an empire from the dirt up does not require the noisy, desperate validation of a crowded ballroom. I did not need the sycophantic applause of high society to confirm my worth. I was perfectly comfortable returning to the stark, unvarnished solitude of my life. The glittering distractions were gone, the treacherous illusions had been burned away, leaving me exactly where I started, armed with nothing but my own unyielding resilience. I reached out and unlatched the brass locks of my leather briefcase for the final time today. I bypassed the heavily redacted offshore loan agreements and the federal fraud indictments. I reached into the back pocket and retrieved a single, simple document. It was the original, legitimate deed to my modest brick house in the suburbs. The forged medical proxy Jordan had used to leverage my home as collateral was now legally void, entirely eradicated by the federal warrants and the undeniable proof of his conspiracy. The house belonged to me, free and clear, permanently shielded from their parasitic ambition. I placed the deed onto the table next to my bourbon glass, smoothing out the paper with a steady hand. The silent adjustment I had orchestrated in the dark of night was now fully realized. The individuals who mistook my patience for senility and my generosity for vulnerability had been systematically dismantled and permanently removed from the board. I picked up my crystal tumbler, holding it up against the fading afternoon light filtering through the grand pavilion windows. I raised my glass to the empty room, offering a silent tribute to the absolute unforgiving nature of consequence. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the bourbon. I closed my eyes, letting the absolute stillness of the empty venue wash over me, breathing in the deep, untroubled silence. The storm was over. Order was finally restored. The heavy steel doors of the elevator sealed shut, taking with them the frantic, desperate echoes of a son I no longer recognized. I remained standing in the penthouse suite for a few moments longer, allowing the profound silence of the empty room to wash over me. The chaotic energy of the federal raid had completely evaporated. I picked up my leather briefcase, walked out of the bridal suite, and made my way slowly down the grand marble staircase. The sprawling botanical garden estate, which just an hour ago had been teeming with 300 elite guests and heavily armed federal agents, was now entirely deserted. The fleet of black armored SUVs was gone, transporting the architects of my attempted destruction to their new reality. I walked through the towering glass doors and entered the main reception hall. The massive climate-controlled pavilion stood as a monument to interrupted vanity. Hundreds of crystal champagne flutes sat untouched on pristine white linen tablecloths, their expensive contents slowly going flat in the afternoon warmth. Elaborate centerpieces of imported white roses and rare orchids were already beginning to wither under the sun, their petals curling and browning at the edges. Platter upon platter of gourmet hors d'oeuvres sat spoiling in the quiet heat. The opulent 5-tier wedding cake stood perfectly intact on a silver pedestal, a ridiculous confectionery tower, waiting for a celebration that would never occur. I walked down the center aisle, my leather shoes clicking softly against the polished hardwood floor. I reached the elevated head table, meticulously designed to showcase Jordan and Meredith to their high society audience. I pulled back the heavy velvet cushioned chair intended for the groom and sat down. I placed my briefcase on the table next to a set of unused gold-plated silverware. I looked out over the vast sea of empty chairs. There was no anger left in my chest. There was no sorrow clouding my vision. The quiet room offered a stark, undeniable physical manifestation of the reality I had just engineered. The glittering artificial world Jordan had sacrificed his soul to inherit had been entirely dismantled, leaving nothing but abandoned crystal and absolute silence. The rhythmic sound of measured footsteps echoed from the far end of the reception hall. I did not turn my head. I knew the cadence perfectly. Mitchell walked down the center aisle, moving with the same relaxed professional efficiency he had displayed during the entire operation. He did not carry his metal clipboard or his encrypted tablet. Instead, he held a heavy, square-shouldered bottle of premium-aged bourbon and two thick crystal tumblers he had undoubtedly procured from the venue's abandoned luxury bar. He reached the head table and set the glasses down onto the pristine white linen. He uncorked the bottle, the rich, smoky aroma of the liquor instantly cutting through the cloying scent of the dying roses. Mitchell poured 2 generous measures, the amber liquid splashing smoothly against the crystal. He handed one glass to me and kept the other for himself. We did not offer a cheerful toast. We did not smile or engage in any triumphant celebration over the ruined lives of my enemies. We simply acknowledged the flawless execution of a perfectly designed strategy. Mitchell took the seat originally designated for Meredith's father. He looked out over the empty pavilion, took a slow sip of his bourbon, and delivered his final operational report. He confirmed that the federal strike team had successfully processed Jordan and Meredith into central holding without incident. He then detailed the swift, catastrophic action taken by the Securities and Exchange Commission against Gregory. The moment Gregory's fabricated liquidity transfer hit the federal wire, the SEC immediately triggered a total asset freeze. Gregory's entire hedge fund, his personal accounts, his corporate real estate holdings, and his offshore safety nets were completely seized by the government. He was currently sitting in a federal interrogation room entirely stripped of his wealth, facing decades in a maximum security penitentiary for masterminding a massive wire fraud conspiracy. The surgical precision of our retaliation had left absolutely no collateral damage. We had not engaged in a messy public screaming match. We had simply utilized the unforgiving mechanics of corporate law and federal oversight to completely excise a malignant tumor from my life. The parasites who had attempted to consume my legacy were now entirely locked inside a federal cage they had built with their own unparalleled greed. I took a slow sip of the bourbon, feeling the sharp, warm burn settle in my chest. Sitting in the vast, empty opulence of the Botanical Garden Pavilion, I felt a deep, resonant connection to the man I was, before the wealth, before the logistics empire, and long before the profound betrayal of my only son. I built my life from absolutely nothing. I started with a single rusted delivery van, calloused hands, and an unbreakable willingness to endure the grueling, silent exhaustion of honest labor. I spent decades working in the freezing quiet hours before dawn, calculating shipping routes under flickering warehouse bulbs, repairing diesel engines, and securing unglamorous corporate contracts while my competitors slept. I did not fear the quiet. I embraced it. Silence was the very foundation upon which I constructed my entire existence. Jordan had viewed my preference for solitude as a weakness, interpreting my quiet, unassuming lifestyle as evidence of a small, pathetic mind. He failed to comprehend that a man who builds an empire from the dirt up does not require the noisy, desperate validation of a crowded ballroom. I did not need the sycophantic applause of high society to confirm my worth. I was perfectly comfortable returning to the stark, unvarnished solitude of my life. The glittering distractions were gone. The treacherous illusions had been burned away, leaving me exactly where I started, armed with nothing but my own unyielding resilience. I reached out and unlatched the brass locks of my leather briefcase for the final time today. I bypassed the heavily redacted offshore loan agreements and the federal fraud indictments. I reached into the back pocket and retrieved a single simple document. It was the original legitimate deed to my modest brick house in the suburbs. The forged medical proxy Jordan had used to leverage my home as collateral was now legally void, entirely eradicated by the federal warrants and the undeniable proof of his conspiracy. The house belonged to me, free and clear, permanently shielded from their parasitic ambition. I placed the deed onto the table next to my bourbon glass, smoothing out the paper with a steady hand. The silent adjustment I had orchestrated in the dark of night was now fully realized. The individuals who mistook my patience for senility and my generosity for vulnerability had been systematically dismantled and permanently removed from the board. I picked up my crystal tumbler, holding it up against the fading afternoon light filtering through the grand pavilion windows. I raised my glass to the empty room, offering a silent tribute to the absolute unforgiving nature of consequence. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the bourbon. I closed my eyes, letting the absolute stillness of the empty venue wash over me, breathing in the deep, untroubled silence. The storm was over. Order was finally restored. True wealth is never measured by the luxury vehicles you drive or the extravagant venues you rent, but by the quiet integrity you maintain when no one is watching. Greed is a blinding poison that convinces the foolish they can outsmart consequence. When you build your foundation on deceit and manipulate those who genuinely love you, you are only constructing the exact prison that will eventually hold you. Dignity requires no audience, and truth needs no defense. Real power lies in the absolute discipline to walk away from toxic relationships and to securely rebuild your peace in total, unapologetic silence. If this story resonated with you, please share your thoughts on setting boundaries and protecting your peace in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful narratives like this one.